Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Didn't mean to touch your dogs.
There we go.
That's perfect.
Well, team, welcome. It's another history group with Daniel. Daniel, it's good to have you back. You were enjoyed quite a bit in our last group.
I'm glad to be here, Maddie.
Good. I'm trying to think. Oh, I do have some announcements for you guys. 2 weeks ago, I asked for you guys to give me feedback, preferably written, and none of you did. Out of the dozens of you, literally 0 people gave me any feedback. So I'm going to assume that you like what we're doing, and we're just going to continue to roll with it. That being said, oh, you guys were watching 7 Years in Tibet while I was gone. I don't know if you finished that or not. If you haven't finished, we'll probably finish that on a weekend evening. If we want to finish it, that is. Without further ado, let's get into it. Oh, this happened again. Nixon. Nixon is somebody that you've studied quite a bit, right, Dan?
Yeah, I have read some books.
About Nixon?
Yeah, some of them.
Some of them were about Nixon. Rumor has it you just finished up a project about Nixon. Did you want to tell us about it?
Yes, I did a research project about federal Native American policy under the Nixon administration from 1969 to 1974. Nixon is often viewed as perhaps the most progressive president when it comes to what is referred to as federal Indian policy.
That's interesting because Nixon really, to my knowledge, not progressive on many other things.
He definitely has a legacy,
Mm-hmm.
and I think a lot of that legacy is negative. But I've spoken to many actual historians that are not me, because I'm not a historian,
Right.
Who believe that Nixon was the last liberal president. But it's important that we define our terms.
Right.
Liberal meaning that free markets should guide government economic policy, and
Interesting. Well, I mean, let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to try to show the parts of Nixon that would defy the narrative of him being 100% a bad guy. Of course, we all know him, or he's famous for the Watergate scandal, where the common narrative is he spied on political opponents to get an advantage in an election, and the evidence against him was so bad, he knew he would be impeached and removed from office. So instead of doing that, he resigned. And I think part of the reason for this was so he could keep his pension as president. Because if you resign, you would get a pension. If you don't, you wouldn't. How true is that, though, Daniel?
Well, let's start at the beginning, right? 1968, Nixon's elected, which we'll talk about later. In 72, he's running against a South Dakotan, George McGovern, who's a Democrat.
You can read all about him in Herbert S. Shell's History of South Dakota. You're going to want the 4th edition because the 3rd edition is just out of date with the publication of the 4th edition.
Were you paid for that?
No, but I would hope to be. You know who does pay me, though? R. Alton Lee. A New Deal for South Dakota. You know something, Daniel? You guys will find this interesting too. While I was in Idaho, I was meeting my father's daughter's boyfriend's sister-in-law, right? Stay with me. I was meeting her and she said, "Oh, where are you from?" And I said, "Oh, I'm from South Dakota." And she goes, "Oh, you sound like it." I said, and she goes, I said,
"What do South Dakotans sound like?"
"South Dakota, making a casserole." A. I don't sound like that. Do
A-
I?
As someone who has lived in South Dakota for 22 years,
Right.
born and raised,
Born and raised, this man.
I cannot attest to that accent. I don't think I talk like that. Maybe I do.
I don't think you do. If I had met you in, well, let's say another state, I wouldn't say, oh, he's from South Dakota. But at the same time, I don't think people meeting me out of state are like, oh, she's from South Dakota. I don't think they think, oh, she's from Texas either, but definitely not South Dakota.
Watergate.
So Christy Noam lost in 72. All right.
So, you might know more about Watergate than I do. So let's kind of walk through this. 1972, he's running against George McGovern.
Mhm.
Almost all the national polls indicate that Nixon's going to win pretty handedly. Nixon had a lot of anxiety about winning re-election, but whether or not he ordered the people to break into the DNC is another thing, and that one is debated amongst historians. But essentially, a group of White House staffers broke into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters, which was located in the Watergate Hotel
No.
in Washington, D.C., and they wiretapped him. The funny thing, though, is they didn't get caught when they were actually placing the recording devices. They were only caught when they went back in to try to cover it up. So the second time they broke in, that's when they were caught, according to my understanding.
That also is my understanding. But even once they were caught, it wasn't like, oh, here's everything, and it wasn't a huge story yet, right? It was fairly contained within the Nixon administration, and then his attempts to keep it within the administration is what got him in trouble, right?
Right, because that's where the crime stems, right? Because
Yeah.
if Nixon had no knowledge of this break-in, then he's not at fault. If it was staffers breaking in and he didn't have anything to do with it, then it's not an impeachable offense. The question comes to whether or not the cover-up was worse than the crime, right? And Nixon had recording devices in the Oval Office, which were installed by his predecessor, President Lyndon B. Johnson. And when ordered to hand them over to the Supreme Court, noticeably, chunks of those recordings were cut out and kind of scratched from the tape. And eventually, Nixon handed the full tapes over, and Republicans in the Senate came to him and said, if the House impeaches you, there won't be the votes to acquit you. Now, whether or not he resigned because of the pension, I don't know. I can certainly say that when faced with that guarantee that you're going to be removed from office, it's probably better to go down in history as someone who resigned willingly than someone who was removed forcibly.
What do you think that says about his legacy? Because I think being the only president to have resigned, we can look at that pretty easily and say, what a failure. But if we compare it to, I mean, yeah, it sounds funny, but if we compare it to other, liberalized Western nations, like in the United Kingdom, prime ministers resign essentially when they aren't effective anymore.
Yeah, when they don't have the majority in parliament to govern effectively. What,
Right.
Liz Truss was the prime minister for 14 days, maybe 12 days?
45.
Wow. Longer than I
Yeah.
expected. She was terrible. But no, I completely agree. And it's quite a misconception that Nixon was impeached because he wasn't.
Right.
When we go down the list of US presidents who have been impeached, you have Andrew Johnson, the Civil War era president that took over after Lincoln's assassination. You have Bill Clinton, who was impeached in what, 1990?
98.
98. And then, of course, you have the former president, Donald J. Trump, who was impeached. So we have three presidents who have been impeached, none of them removed or resigned from office. And some of them definitely should have. Mostly, from my point of view, Andrew Johnson was the most egregious offender of the three, but
I would totally agree. I think it's very easy, though, to say that the crime that Bill Clinton was charged with, he was absolutely guilty
yeah,
of
lying
lying
under oath.
under
Yeah.
oath. Yeah, whether or not that was such an offense to say he should be removed from office for what he did, I think that's where I get lost on that because I don't think it was.
Yeah, and we don't have to get into the specifics there, but that
Right.
case involved an abuse of power
Hmm.
in an attempt to cover that abuse of power up. And it's interesting that we see the same thing going on right now in a criminal case in New York about whether or not the lie was meant to protect family or protect political purposes. And I think that's the same line of reasoning that Bill Clinton gave in 98. Was it meant to protect his political image or protect his family? I don't know. I don't have the answers.
I don't know. It is a really interesting case though, and it's fascinating that this is primarily what he's remembered for, and we still don't really understand all of his motive behind everything. We will probably never understand with complete clarity everything that happened in Watergate. Um,
But, before we move on, if while
mhm.
we're on the topic of Watergate, I think it is, I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that Nixon was not a bad president. Nixon's typically remembered as one of the worst presidents of all time.
I agree. Yeah.
And I think it's easy to say that, right? Because almost all the history that covers him revolves around his criminal conduct. And of course, you have the famous Supreme Court case, US v. Nixon, and that is studied at length. But I think there's a lot more to the man, Richard Milhouse Nixon.
So let's learn more about Milhouse.
Yes, let's dive deeper.
So
He was a jack of all trades.
he really liked playing football, and then his evil cousin Dracula played the violin. But so before he got into politics, he played football for what? University of Iowa, right?
No,
No. Oh, I have this wrong.
no, he played football at Whittier College
Oh,
in California. Whittier was a relatively small town. It was in Los Angeles County. It still is. Obviously, the town isn't gone. Um, and from what I've read, he was actually quite good at football. Interestingly enough, his coach at Whittier was a Native American, someone he revered as a father figure, and some historians point to that as maybe his beginnings in his appreciation of the struggles of Native American communities and listening to their voices.
interesting. So I don't know really anything about Nixon's upbringing, but was there anything else in his childhood or his young adulthood that you could see kind of shape his policy and how his political career went?
Yes, I think so. Both of his parents were pretty upstanding members of the Whittier community. His mom was of the Quaker faith, so Nixon was raised as a religious minority in California. Um, I remember there's an old story about Nixon's parents. They ran a general store in Whittier, and they were very against segregation, and they were also very opposed to discrimination on the basis of certain attributes. And so,
For the time, very progressive views.
yes, because we're
Yeah.
talking, the 1920s, 1930s, leading up into Nixon's adult life. And Nixon was taught by his parents not to discriminate against um, any individual coming into their store. And they were also very generous in terms of, letting people pay as they could. And so I think he had a generous upbringing, but a humble upbringing. He was not well off. Nixon came from a relatively low to middle class family, unlike many presidents, in particular, the person we'll talk about who he opposed in 1960. But when you look at presidents who came from nothing, Nixon has to be a part of that conversation. A very ambitious individual, and we talk about he was a football player. He was a musician of some sort. His classically trained on the piano. He was an actor. He was a debater. He did a little bit of everything.
So what drove him into politics?
From my understanding, after he got out of the military, because he served in World War II, when he got back to California, it would have been 45 or 46. I don't know the exact date. A local political official encouraged him to run for the House of Representatives, which he did. He ran for the House of Representatives.
How about that?
Yes, in a district that was controlled by, it was either a democratically controlled district or a Republican stronghold with an incumbent. Can you tell the audience what an incumbent is?
An incumbent is a person that already holds office. So when you vote to re-elect somebody, that is the incumbent staying in office, as opposed to, I don't know, is the term just challenger?
Yeah.
That would, yeah. Somebody who is not in that office seeking an election.
And of course, the incumbent has quite an incredible advantage, right, in terms of fundraising and name recognition. But at the end of World War II, there was quite a few veterans who ran for political office, and there was a lot of admiration for them, so they did quite well at the polling booth after the war. And I think that's where Nixon's success starts.
So we see a lot of Nixon's success kind of follow the Eisenhower route of this is a war hero, not necessarily a politician, but this is a man who embodies what we want our country to be. So,
how about him?
How about him? Shout out Nixon.
I wish I could do half the things he did.
Same. He now has boats named after him.
Really?
Isn't I think Nixon class is a class of aircraft carrier. Could be wrong.
I wouldn't know anything about that.
I really don't know. I think so though.
Were you on board the USS Nixon?
No. In fact, I think the biggest boat I've ever been on was my grandfather's canoe.
Never been on a canoe either.
Oh, they're fun.
How about him?
I shot Bin Laden. Who's next? So this man that we're looking at, let me make us a little smaller so we can read that. Okay, now that you've read it, we're big again. That doesn't look like Nixon. Who is that?
Well, that is Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin.
Joseph McCarthy. You guys actually, I think you guys have learned about this fairly recently in school. McCarthyism, the Red Scare. McCarthy was the pioneer of the anti-communist movement, started the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he chaired that committee into essentially trying to label people as communists to get them blacklisted. And a lot of celebrities were blacklisted as communists.
Dalton Trumbo, right? The famous Hollywood writer got blacklisted.
That's right. And what was Nixon's role in this then?
So at the end of World War II, right, the U.S. and the Soviet Union are allies to some degree, right? Because they were on the Allied forces against the fascist Nazi regime and the Italians and etc. But at the end of World War II, you start to see this break between the Soviet Union and the United States as to who will be the dominant global power. And there's a fear in the United States of
Swifties.
Yeah, and communists.
Can we just take a moment though and recognize Taylor Swift?
I was listening to Taylor Swift on my way here.
No kidding. Last night I fell asleep listening to the Eras tour on Disney.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was listening to Down Bad.
Oh. Are you better?
I'm doing okay.
He's doing okay.
I'm doing okay.
Guys, if you'd like to support Daniel, his phone number is 605.
And my social security.
He lives it.
Yeah. My Venmo.
I one time put my Venmo at the end of a PowerPoint I did in class. Somebody sent me $1.
So let's talk about communism before we address Nixon's role in fighting communism.
Right.
What is communism, Maddie? You would know.
So communism, as I had taught you guys before. Shut up. Communism is the idea that the means of production should be owned by those who are producing, the proletariat, the working class. There should be no massive accumulation of money. In a pure communist society, there would be no need for money. There's a central government that distributes different things and calls for the production of what is needed. Sorry, am I boring you, Daniel?
Was the Soviet Union a communist state?
No. I would say no. In terms of this, do we need to recognize them?
Absolutely.
More like hardcore socialism over there. I wouldn't say it was communist.
It was certainly Marxist.
It drew from Marxist ideology,
Yes.
I would say. Yeah.
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 And especially in the run-up to World War II, you had a mass mobilization of the government directing certain industries to make certain quotas of goods. And you saw the Russian economy in the 1920s boom, right? Because of all of this military industry, right? They were ramping up for war. And some other things happened in Ukraine in the 1930s, which we won't talk about now either. But
the early motivation of the Soviet Union absolutely was communist.
Yes.
Whether or not they were able to achieve all their goals is what makes me say they fall short of being a communist state.
Yeah, and also it's questionable as to whether any state that desires to be the global hegemonic power, meaning the only power, the only major power, can truly be a communist state, right? So whether or not the Soviet Union is pure communism, we can leave aside. That's not what we're talking about. But it was used for political purposes to kind of separate the US and the Soviet Union as a capitalist and a communist states. Could we agree on that?
Yes. Well, yeah, absolutely.
And so Joseph McCarthy, he had a list.
Mm-hmm. People like Kristi Noem,
Taylor Swift,
Taylor Swift,
Dalton Trumbo.
Dalton Trumbo,
Throw Jimmy Kimmel in there.
Jimmy Kimmel probably, Bubba Gump Shrimp Company for sure.
Disney.
Disney, without a doubt.
Ron DeSantis.
DeSantis.
I think that pretty much sums it up.
And I think Barbie, but the film, not the person.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that tracks.
I do want to make very clear that one person who we've not mentioned, who is very dear to my heart, is not a communist, even though he's red. Lightning McQueen would be a staunch capitalist. I mean, the man wears advertisements. He's sponsored by Rusty's medicated bumper ointment.
So the funny thing about Joseph McCarthy is he would have lists that he said, these are the communists in the administrative state. And every day that list would either grow or shrink, mostly grow. And he never revealed his secrets until the late 1950s, where he he began to be recognized for his lies, and his political career went bye-bye, and then he died just a few years later. It's kind of a sad story. But Nixon relates to all this because Nixon was also a fervent anti-communist.
He was.
And he would later serve from 1952 to 1960 in the Eisenhower administration as the vice president.
So was his role as vice president, because vice president doesn't have any asserted powers beyond presiding over the Senate, right?
Yeah.
So how did Nixon interpret his role? We saw Vice President Cheney. He had a very defense-heavy role.
Kamala Harris has a very policy-driven role right now.
Absolutely. Joe Biden was relieved that he could afford, his aviator sunglasses and ice cream.
How much does the vice president get paid? Do a quick Google for us.
Yeah. While you talk about Nixon. as vice president.
Yeah, my knowledge here is actually very minimal. I don't know much about Nixon's vice presidency. Um, what I can say is that a lot of Eisenhower's policies didn't necessarily align with Nixon's policies that he would later sign into law. And one of the things that I think can explain this is the fact that the congressional composition in the 1950s was much different than the congressional composition of the late 1960s and 70s, where the Democrats largely controlled both houses of Congress during Nixon's years as president, but the Republicans had a much firmer grasp under Eisenhower. So I think Eisenhower had a lot more free rein to do what his policy agenda was in his presidency than Nixon did from 69 to 74. But other than that, I don't know much about his vice presidency. Do you have any thoughts to share?
I really don't, other than the fact that his vice presidency gave him the platform to run for president initially, which I think is.
Well, just wait.
Oh.
Now wait. Now I have one more thing.
Daniel's got something else.
Well, did you find us?
Oh, I did. 146 round to 147,000 a year.
Now here's an interesting idea. How much should elected officials make?
I think my opinion on this is actually unpopular. I don't think they're paid nearly enough.
I actually agree.
Oh.
Maybe we have different lines of reasoning though.
Okay.
What's your line of reasoning?
Mine is I want our elected officials paid more so that it doesn't take somebody with an already massive net worth and income to run for the job. If we make the salary so low to where it can't attract people to run for the job, then we're only going to be controlled by people who are already rich and powerful because they can afford to have two residences, one in their constituency and one in DC.
I completely agree, and I think you see this thought in the founding papers, right? They believed that our elected officials should be paid a reasonable salary, and I think they shared that fear that if they didn't get paid anything, or if they got paid a very meager salary, the people who would be running for office are your lawyers, your dentists, and people who make a good amount of money. Coming from South Dakota, if you ever get a chance to look at the composition of the South Dakota legislature, you'll notice that a lot of them are retired, right? Because they now have the time and the money to do so. Unfortunately, we need to work towards, I think, fixing that so that everyday working Americans can serve. Anyways, is a kid who shares his toys on the playground a communist?
Well, is he sharing his toys or is he directing others to share their toys as well? Because I would say if he is sharing his toys, he might just be a selfless person.
Yeah.
If he is going around saying, no, 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 I shared my toys, you guys have to share yours too, then he'd be a communist.
I think Joseph McCarthy would say if you share anything, you're a communist.
I would agree.
Like if you gave me a drink of your Dr. Pepper, you'd be a communist.
Should we test it? Did you want a drink? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I was hinting.
Let's see what happens.
Can I?
Yeah. You know, I am getting an interesting feeling now. I'm
getting a revolutionary feeling.
Uh-oh. Oh boy. I have the sudden urge to walk. My hands are turning blue.
We're going to seize the means of production.
Oh my God.
Stop. Stop. Moving on.
Moving on.
Oh, technical difficulties.
Again, jeez. Millhouse.
So tell me your thoughts on this debate, because I have a little bit of background knowledge on this that might help.
Let's set up some context first. So Nixon was vice president under Eisenhower. He decides well, with this platform I have now, I'm going to run for president. 1960, right?
Yep.
The election of 1960. Who else is running in that election? JFK. This is before he got shot, because after he got shot and died, he just didn't have the energy to run a campaign. So
That's terrible.
but this debate between Nixon and Kennedy was the first that would be televised. There had been others that were radio broadcast. And that's generally the experience that Nixon had. So he showed up with a lot of talking points and everything. Kennedy showed up to be on camera. So Kennedy, although people, yeah, I'll save that right now. But I think that this is a big turning point for our country, and this is one of the moments where you can absolutely say television dictates politics.
Yeah, the celebritization of politics, right?
Absolutely.
There's a famous study that was conducted after this debate about individuals who listened to the debate on radio, only hearing the voices and the opinions of the two candidates, and those who watched the debates. And what the study found is that people who watched the debate heavily favored Kennedy. But those who listened to it, it was a pretty even split with a slight favor towards Nixon, which is a really interesting development in politics. But from my background on this, because if you're looking at this image, I don't think it's hard to tell which one is the more presidential looking candidate. But what's interesting is that from my knowledge of this day, Nixon had been out campaigning all day. He was vice president, so his schedule was far busier than at the time Senator John Kennedy's, and he had to catch up on campaigning, so he was moving around all day and he was exhausted, short on sleep, and which gives him the look that he had there. He had developed a cold, and I think this is an interesting time to kind of offer a contrast to these two candidates, because I mentioned earlier that Nixon grew up relatively not so well off in California. He was raised by a working class family, whereas John F. Kennedy was raised in a very well off family in Massachusetts. His dad had money and influence. And, obviously the Kennedy family is a dynasty in American politics, and money will do that. He had a lot of money, but both of them are veterans. JFK served in the US military, so it's one thing they have in common.
My understanding of the background on Nixon here is pretty much the same as yours. He was getting sick, and after being out all day campaigning, he was starting to get some signs of heat stroke. And then with early television, you have to, powder makeup on your face, and then there's really hot lights. So that obviously made it worse. Meanwhile, you had Kennedy, who, I mean, seasoned PR man, given his family status. He knew how to win a crowd easy, and it transferred to television really well. So, spoiler alert, Nixon lost this. He did not become president right now. JFK won. JFK then died via being shot in the head.
Oh my God.
It's quite funny, actually.
No.
Because,
no, it's not.
Because the shot came, right, and his brains flew out. And then his wife, Jackie, was like, oh, he might need that. So she picks it up. She was holding his brain. Listen, I love my family dearly. If I were in a parade with somebody that I love and they got shot and their brains went everywhere, and I was faced with the option, now I could either pick up the brain or I could try to stop the bleeding. I think I'd stop the bleeding, because realistically, I don't want to hold their brain because I'm going to get it dirty. And once it's dirty, they can't even reattach it.
I think there were other concerns.
Oh,
I don't know if that worked. The science there is inconclusive as to whether or not you could just reattach the brain and call it good.
well, my hypothesis, right, is no.
Spoiler alert, Nixon lost. Kennedy becomes president, dies in 63. Johnson takes over, president until 68. Spoiler alert, Nixon is going to come back.
And he comes back as the villain. Or does he? Who was the villain in 1968 in the election there?
I think hindsight is 2020,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Now, I can't speak to what who I would have voted for if I was someone living in 1968, but I think with hindsight, out of the three candidates up there, it's pretty easy to tell who is the villain,
Hmm.
right? Governor George Wallace.
Yeah.
What state was he from? Alabama?
I believe so. Yes.
Yeah, he was a staunch segregationist. Not a great guy. Pretty troubled man. Um,
So something I should mention, I haven't shown you guys yet. I remember a few weeks ago when I was doing flying burpees for motion group. This is my phone now, right? Let me see if it'll turn on. This baby's toast. Okay, I almost put bread on it and ate it. Or bread, butter. You don't put bread on toast. You put, anyways, garbage. So Nixon won this one. That gives me generally two questions. How was his debate performance? What did he learn from the first one? And who was he running against? What were the primary differences between Nixon and Humphrey?
it's interesting because the Democratic nominee here is not Lyndon B. Johnson, although he could have ran for a second term, right? Because he was only elected to one, so he had the constitutional right to run for another term, but he chose not to because he was becoming less and less popular. The war in Vietnam was still raging on in 1968, and he is remembered, whether or not you can say definitively that it was his fault. But Johnson really pushed us further into Vietnam, and young Americans really did not want that. And there was a lot of dissent there. And you see this at the 1968 Democratic National Convention when Hubert Humphrey becomes the Democratic nominee. Now, who else was running for the Democratic nomination in 68?
RFK.
RFK. Who's RFK?
RFK is JFK's younger brother, who at the time was living.
And then he was not.
And then he straight up he said, "Hey brother, I'm gonna pull a you."
Yes, in the summer of 68, him and Martin Luther King Jr. both unfortunately do pass away from,
From murder.
yeah. And so you have a very unpopular Democratic nominee, mix that in with George Wallace, who presumably is stealing votes from kind of more of the traditional segregationist Southern view. Whether or not that would break down towards Democrat voters or Republican voters at this time, probably hard to tell, but it probably helped Nixon.
Um, I don't know. I mean, I haven't studied this extensively, so you're probably better. I would say though that Wallace's presence hurt Nixon.
Perhaps. I think it probably had the effect of helping and hurting. A lot of those old school Democrats in the South who maybe had more traditional racial views. Um, and keep in mind that this is only four years after the Civil Rights Act was passed in
Right.
64 and the Voting Rights Act in 65. So race is at kind of the forefront of American politics. So I think it's hard to say, especially as two people who have not studied the 1968 election at length,
Right.
who he hurt more. But let's say he hurt Nixon more. Nixon barely won. He won South Dakota.
He did.
We have
Which
4 votes.
this is really important because if you were in South Dakota at the time and you voted, statistically, it's more likely you would have voted for Nixon.
Wow. Wow. One of the things I always like to look at when we look at these results is the difference between the popular vote percentage and the
Yeah,
percentage of
absolutely.
electoral votes, right? Nixon only won 43% of the popular vote, but he won 56% of the electoral college. Interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it? how much of that went into the Nixon campaign of knowing that you have a third party running, so you have to strategically try to cast out where your votes are coming from? Do you know much about the Nixon campaign?
Well, the one thing I really have a strong recollection of from the 1968 campaign is Nixon's appeal to Southern voters.
Mm-hmm.
He adopted what's been referred to as the Southern strategy to appeal to disaffected Southern Democrats who were upset either by the expansion of the federal government via the Gray Society, the New Deal coalition, etc., or the breaking down of racist, segregational laws. So I think Nixon politically made a very wise move by appealing to those disaffected Democrats and kind of bringing them into the new Republican coalition. I think that no doubt helped him.
Mm-hmm.
But by observing this map, he didn't win the southern states. I mean,
No.
he won South Carolina, sure, and Tennessee, but the deep South he lost. And it's quite impressive for a third party candidate to outright win 5 states.
I think this was the last election where the Deep South wasn't Republican across the board
Mm.
until 2020.
Yep.
Interesting to note. Anything else on this slide, Daniel?
I don't think so.
Okay. So when Nixon won the election, this is also when the Queen was doing some sketchy stuff, and through a loophole in international law, Richard Nixon became the King of England. I don't know if you knew about this, but
Factually not true.
all right, well, then tell us what happened.
So Nixon became president in 1969. He served for 5 years until he resigned in 74 because of Watergate, which we already talked about.
Talked about that one, yeah.
All 5 years of his presidency, Congress was controlled by Democrats. They controlled the House and the Senate all 5 years. So Nixon had a much different experience than Eisenhower would. I mentioned earlier that he is largely recognized as the last liberal president. And part of this is due to the fact that Nixon was actually a big proponent of regulation. He predates kind of, Reagan rose to power in the 80s by kind of appealing to this anti-big government, anti-regulatory state. But Nixon very much favored regulation, right? He creates the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which grants the administration very broad, sweeping powers to define what environmental regulation is. So Nixon was a Republican that is different from today's definition of what republicanism means. I mentioned prior that Nixon he signed a lot of legislation helping Native Americans. His track record on civil rights is kind of touchy. At times, he spoke out in favor of a more progressive civil rights vision, and then at times he especially private comments, he had a lot of fear towards younger generations and voters of color, voting against him, which I think almost every decision that Nixon made, the political ramifications of it were in the back of his head.
Nixon, I think, brought more power, if not direct power to the presidency, than the image of power, because Nixon isn't necessarily remembered for what he did with Congress, because as you mentioned, Congress was controlled by Democrats the whole time. But when people think back on different things, Nixon opened relations with China. It wasn't necessarily America opened relations. Nixon brought us off the gold standard. Nixon ultimately brought the conclusion to the Vietnam War.
After expanding.
Right, after we'll get to that. is it fair to say that Nixon was a strong-armed president?
That is actually a really difficult question. Nixon represents a break in American foreign policy. And it's interesting that you bring that up, and I'm glad that you did, because for those historians who don't remember Nixon for Watergate, they remember him for foreign policy, right? You have, the famous uh, video of him getting off the airplane in China. He was the first American president to step foot in China, representing a striking change in American foreign policy towards states that were kind of in the Soviet bloc and under Soviet Union influence. His foreign policy was known as détente, right? And I think it was a positive step in the right direction towards leading with diplomacy rather than leading with strength necessarily. I don't necessarily think you compromise strength when you emphasize diplomacy, though. But whether or not he could be regarded as a strongman president, I don't know. I think that's hard to say.
Interesting.
I
Okay.
don't think I would consider Richard Nixon to be a strong man or a strong arm the presidency,
Interesting.
right? Because when you talk about something like taking the US off the gold standard, that wasn't done unilaterally. That was done with the consent of the Federal Reserve and Congress. And so I don't know. He certainly projected power, though, I would say.
Right. Yeah.
Let's talk about Cambodia.
Yeah. Sometimes he projected power right into the home of an innocent Cambodian family through the means of a bomb. He'd blow them up. I mean, anyways, Daniel, what was it like?
To be in Cambodia in 1972 or or what?
I'll rephrase the question. We were at war with Vietnam.
Mhm.
Why did Nixon make the decision to bomb Cambodia? And whose approval did he get to do that? Who signed off on this?
Well, he's the president,
Mhm.
so he doesn't really need approval, right? The War Powers Resolution of 1972 attempted to rein that in, uh, but was quite a failure, to be honest, because the presidents just seeked more covert ways. And we see this now with drone strikes in particular that are ways for the president to get around the War Powers Resolution. But as to why it was expanded to Cambodia, I am not a Vietnam historian. I can't tell you why. What I can tell you is that this was largely kept secret from the American public. Um, the expansion into Vietnam was not known for quite some years, and when it was made known, it was largely disgraced.
Mhm. My understanding, which could be totally wrong, this could all be wrong. What I've heard is the Viet Cong were using trails out of Vietnam into Cambodia to get down to try to escape US bombing.
Yeah.
So they did that. Nixon saw that and he was like, I don't like loopholes. So he bombed those trails instead, or in addition. That could be wrong. I haven't read a lot about Vietnam, but that's my understanding.
But I do think it strikes kind of a greater theme of Nixon's presidency of this push and pull between, you know, being remembered as a groundbreaking president that produced a lot of positive change. I think you can point to his foreign policy towards China and the Soviet Union in that, and some of his domestic policies. But then you also have things like the expansion into Vietnam after Johnson is, kind of a detracting factor in his presidency. But he, it's sort of a contradiction, right? Because you see his want to respect state sovereignty and still engage diplomatically and economically with states like China, but then building off of years of foreign policy that believed in the domino theory, right? Of, well, if this state falls to communism, it's going to continue to spread, or if we stop it here, communism will eventually fall. It's hard to pair those two things together.
Ditto.
So Nixon,
Oh, Nixon.
Watergate, August 1974,
Mhm.
Nixon resigns. What happens next?
The savior comes in. So constitutionally, Daniel, you're the political scientist, so correct me if I'm wrong. When the president resigns, the vice president takes over. Historically speaking, there's a lot of because the Constitution never really says in the event of the absence of the president, or the complete absence of the president, the vice president would take power. That was fixed through the amendment process. I think it was Harrison first. He died, and there was a big constitutional question of what now? So they eventually decided the vice president becomes president. Um, one of the so Nixon's vice president was Spiro Agnew, but then he resigned or was yeah.
What a great name. Can we talk about the name
Absolutely.
Spiro Agnew? What a great name, Spiro Agnew. Resigned in disgrace.
Yeah.
And Nixon appointed Gerald Ford as his new vice president. Maddie, before the cameras started rolling, you were telling me an interesting anecdote about Nixon and Ford playing football together.
Now that I know he didn't go to the University of Iowa, I was wrong.
And what a forgetful presidency this is.
It really was.
However, the big thing we need to talk about here is the pardon.
Absolutely. So
You want to comment on that little note that says forgiveness of sins?
So forgiveness of sins is like what Jesus does. Okay. You guys know about Jesus. He had the long hair, and the Romans, they said, we're gonna crucify you. And he was like, well, let me have supper one last time. And then he brought his homies and they had supper, right? Ford didn't really do that though. He just kind of showed up and forgave the sins without the crucifixion. He didn't have a last supper. Um, so he said, hey, Brody, Nixon, you're good. You're not going to face any punishment for what you totally didn't do. But this is essentially saying there is so much evidence against Nixon, even though he has resigned, criminal charges could still be brought on him. And Ford is saying that's not going to happen.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the pardon is Nixon was quite hesitant towards the pardon because he believed that accepting a pardon from the president would admit guilt.
Right.
Right. Um, so maybe this leads into a greater question, and maybe Maddie, you can give your thoughts about whether the pardon was the right decision, right? Because if this is the only thing Ford is known for, the pardon, did he make the right decision?
I think that's really difficult to say. I think had he not done the pardon, the Department of Justice likely would have gone after Nixon. And I think either way, Ford has no good political moves to make out of that situation. Um, I don't think he would have gotten reelected if he didn't pardon him. He obviously didn't get reelected with the pardon. As far as like tough presidencies go, he had a pretty easy one, but he had just such bad cards to play.
I don't know if I'd go so far as to say he had an easy presidency.
Oh, okay.
I mean, the U.S. doesn't officially withdraw from Vietnam until 75.
Right.
The 1970s is historically known for the oil and gas crisis and high inflation. So Ford kind of got a terrible hand of cards. Ford was
Right.
dealt a bad hand. Um, that's one of the things that we neglected or forgot to talk about when we were talking about Nixon's presidency, but there was a lot of conflict between the United States and OPEC over oil production during and after Nixon's presidency that caused gas prices to rise and gas shortages. I'm sure we've all seen video clips of gas lines, right? And based on the number of your license plate, you'd have a different
Right.
day to go to the gas station, which is so interesting to think about. But Ford kind of had a rough time. Shout out my boy Gerald.
I can't think of a single thing I've read about Ford where I could think Good job.
I
And I'm not saying it's like you said, dealt a terrible hand, but I mean, if I were putting his resume together, I'd quit.
I mean, what's the interest rate right now? Like 5%?
Um, I have no idea actually.
Interest rates under Ford and then later under Carter rose to as high as 17 to 18%. So if we think interest rates are high now,
Yeah.
imagine trying to buy a home under Gerald Ford. Thanks, Gerald. But I do think I'm going to go to bat for Gerald here, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think the pardon was the right decision.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I think my dad's calling.
We're gonna take a break.
No, we're not.
Oh, we're gonna go right through it.
I'll call him back later. Gerald Ford's my dad.
I pardon Daniel.
But no, I think the pardon was the right move, not only politically, because I don't think in any situation Ford was going to get reelected.
Right.
I mean, Carter was no great candidate either, he got trounced in 1980, but anybody would have been better than Gerald Ford.
Yeah.
But still, just look at the guy. When you look at Gerald, I mean, I'm not saying anything mean about him. He just screams, "I'm boring."
Well, I was telling Daniel before we started filming, he looks like he works at Home Depot.
Oh my!
Like in the lumber yard. It doesn't look like you should go up to him and say, Mr. President, here's the situation. It looks like you should go up to him and say, hey, I'm building a shed. What size wood do you recommend? And I bet you he'd have better answers on the shed than he would anything in global politics.
He knew the football field.
He sure did.
But I think the pardon was the right move. I think it allowed the American people to kind of move on from Watergate. When you study American citizens' trust in U.S. institutions such as Congress, the media, the presidency, Watergate, along with, the terrorist attacks on September 11th. Am I allowed to talk about those?
Yeah.
So, when you're studying events like Watergate, 9/11, the Clinton scandal, right? These are moments in which you see a significant decline in American trust. And so I think it was important that the country move on from Nixon. And whether or not Americans would have gotten some gratification of seeing justice play out for Nixon, whether or not it can be defined as justice, I don't know. But I think it was the right move. It allowed the country to move on. And of course, 4 years later, we get Ronnie Reagan.
That's right. We have another slide.
Nope.
Oh.
Let's do some concluding remarks.
Let's do that. To quote my hero, Jawa number 2 in Shakespeare's Star Wars, "Me puna taina ding."
And to quote Richard Nixon, the American people deserve to know that their president is not a crook. I am not a crook.
And a crook, he was not.
Or maybe he was.
He's kind of a crook.
But I still like him. I'm a big fan of the underdog story, and Nixon was certainly an underdog. I don't know what I am. Anyways, see you next time.
Have a great night, team.
Was that good or bad?
I think that went